Hey guys, so the ban list finally dropped and boy was it a weird one. I thought I'd do a bit of a data review of this ban list, going over things like how long each card was legal for, the win percentage of the decks that played these cards that were hit, comparison to my ban list prediction survey results, and more. Now I'm not going to cover every card that was changed on this recent list, but just focusing on the cards that were banned and a couple that were put to semi-limited. Now to start off, we now have 101 cards that are forbidden, and not surprisingly, the majority or just under 2/3 of the list are monsters, with about a quarter being spells and 10% being traps. If you break down the banned monsters, then over half are your main deck effect monsters, with another 20% being Xyz monsters. And speaking of banned Xyz monsters, if you're playing Master Duel, you probably realize that for whatever reason, Rongo is still legal in that game. And then you have 16% of banned monsters being Link monsters, kind of high considering that it is the newest summoning mechanic. And then you have Synchro and Fusion monsters making up the remaining 11%. Now as for limited cards for this one, while monsters still make up the most at 51%, spells are quite high up there on the limited list at 43%. Although Raigeki is finally off from 1 to 3 for our spells, so it looks like we're back into the early 2000s. Not a lot of traps on the limited list, although Imperial Order is a huge change now that it went from 1 to 0. Again, if you break down the limited monsters, then most are main deck effect monsters at 64%, and you do have some normal monsters due to the Exodia pieces. And then you have several Xyz and Synchro monsters, only 2 Link monsters that are limited, which are Striker Dragon and Meow Meow Mew, both of which were very recent hits. And then you have 1 Fusion in Gem Knight Master Diamond and 1 Ritual in Ben 10. Now I'm not going to bother covering the semi-limited list though, since it is pretty small. Now let's cover the cards that were newly banned on this list that will take into effect for February. So the first on the axe was Arch Nemesis Protos, which is a pretty unfair card since you can call an attribute and typically people will blind call Dark and that'll do it. And the opponent won't be able to special summon monsters of that declared attribute for their turn. It was also easily searchable in Sword Soul, which was arguably the best deck in the current format post-October ban list. Now Protos is actually a pretty new card being released back in April 2020 in Eternity Code. Really went under the radar at that point since no top deck would be playing this thing, but after 6 ban lists it is now put to rest. Now about a month ago I sent out a survey to fellow Yu-Gi-Oh players on what they predict will happen on the ban list, and I got about 750 responses. Now when it came to Protos, about 19% predicted that the card would be banned, so it wasn't all that high, and yet it indeed did get axed. So Protos, as I said before, is a card played in Sword Soul. Now I bring a meta analysis on a monthly basis where I look at what the top 25 ranked players on Dueling Book are playing for the period of October 2021 to January 2022, so essentially the period from the last ban list to now. If I add up all of the values from my meta analysis, you see something like this. Sword Soul among the top players won about 72% of their matches, and their win percentage by die roll was pretty much the same, so it didn't really matter for them. Especially the Tenyi variant, the deck is actually very capable of going second, and some early iterations actually intentionally went second. Now for each of my monthly meta analysis, if you look at how many matches our top ranked players use Sword Soul, you see that in November it was the 4th most played deck among the top players, and by December and January it was the most played deck among the top ranked players. In fact, in January almost half of all of the matches played by our top 25 ranked players involved Sword Soul. Of course the deck was not available in October, so that's why you don't see any values for that month. Next to be banned is Eva, which is played in Drytron, where it's predominantly just sent to grade through Beatrice's effect, and that would trigger Eva to add an Orange Herald and Diviner, so basically provides a monster negate as well as a follow-up. It was put to 1 on the last ban list, and at that point people complained that really did nothing since a lot of players were just running 1 Eva to begin with. Now Eva was released in the Wave of Light structure deck back 4 years ago, which was honestly considered as one of the worst structure decks, at least at the time. Like I mentioned earlier, it did get put to 1 after about 15 ban lists, and now on the very next ban list was banned, even though admittedly Drytron was not doing much lately. If we look at the ban list prediction survey results, the majority did not think it was going to change for Eva, with only 12% predicting this card to be banned, but it still got the axe nonetheless. As mentioned already, Eva is a key piece in Drytron, and if I add up my meta-analysis values for Drytron, the deck won about 71% of their matches, where it did perform better if it won the die roll, since it is a going first reliant deck. Now right after the ban list, among the top players, Drytron was the most played deck actually, but over time in the last few months its popularity among the top ranked players on Dueling Book did decline, with most recent January analysis showing Drytron to be the 7th most played among our top players. The dominance of Sword Soul and Protos calling light meant that Drytron really struggled. Next on the ban list is the big bird Simorgh, which some did call for its head because of how easily it can bring out Apex Avian for the Omni Negate and Bird Up, one of the best decks at the moment, although it was also used to bring out Wind Barrier Statue to lock out opponents from special summoning other than wind monsters. This card is technically pretty new, coming out at the start of the pandemic in Dual Overload, but alas, after surviving 7 ban lists, it is finally forbidden. Now based on my prediction survey, I actually thought Wind Barrier might be the one to get the axe. Anyways, among those that thought that Wind Barrier Statue won't get banned, almost a third did think that Simorgh will get banned instead, and looks like they were right. So Simorgh was played in Tri-Brigade builds predominantly, and from November and beyond, this was really more so Tri-Brigade Lyrilisk after people moved on from the pure Tri builds. Anyways, when I add up the values for my monthly meta analysis for the 4-month period, Tri-Brigade was a pretty insanely consistent deck, winning 74% of the matches among our top players, where they did have a higher win percentage if they won the die roll at 79 versus 69%. The deck went from a control playstyle to a heavy combo following the Literalist cards being incorporated, so they did become going first heavy. Now post October ban list, this deck was the 3rd most popular and then becoming the most popular among our top players in November, and then quickly falling to 2nd in December and January due to the popularity of Sword Soul. Still, this deck has been a popular choice among the top ranked players for a while now, and we'll see how the deck changes with some of the hits like Simorgh and Recital Starling. Next on the ban hammer was Imperial Order, and I think most of us are probably very happy about this, negating a key mechanic of the game and also being played in so many top tier strategies even if they weren't even a control deck, made it really unfun to play against. This is of course a really old card, being released way back in 2002 in Pharaoh's Servant, and it actually did get limited pretty quickly just a couple of months later on the 4th ever ban list. And then a couple of years later it did get banned, but in 2017 it actually came back to 1 with an errata. For the original Imperial Order, you paid 700 life points only on your standby phase, and you were also able to just choose whether to let it die, even though you had enough life points. The errata did change that a bit, but it was still far too strong and finally is forbidden yet again after almost 5 years since coming back. From the prediction survey, over half did predict that this card will be banned, and it seemed like it was an obvious choice for a ban even for the last list, but glad Konami finally got to it this time around. Now Imperial Order doesn't belong to any specific deck, although back in last format this was very commonly seen in pure Tri-Brigade lists. So back then in September I was doing an analysis on Tri-Brigade decks piloted by the top players, and I did notice that when they resolved Imperial Order, they won 89% of those games, while winning 69% of games when Imperial Order was not activated or did not resolve. So the difference was not as big as I thought it would be, at least for this deck, but still, considering that it still can just be an auto win for a lot of decks, I'm glad it got banned. So I'm going to skip the new cards on the limited list and instead focus on a couple of cards in the semi-limited list now, starting with Fusion Destiny. Now this card of course has become very common because it's the best way to bring out Destroyer Phoenix Enforcer for any deck, basically the new Dragoon except it's much more common. This card was released in Dark Neostorm back in 2019 and is now semi-limited. The card actually got banned in the OCG recently, but we do have an ultimate rare printing of Fusion Destiny coming out in the next OTS pack, so we all knew it wasn't actually going to be banned yet here. Now as for the prediction survey, I actually did not even list Fusion Destiny as an option. Instead, I had Anaconda because I thought that this was the card that was going to be hit instead, and almost half did predict this card to be banned. Now in my recent analytical video on DPE, I did see that among some of the most played decks among our top ranked players that ran DPE, most did predominantly summon it out through hard activating Fusion Destiny than relying on Anaconda, particularly Dogmatica Invoked and Sky Striker. So putting it to 2 will just be a slap on the wrist in consistency, but I think if they were not going to ban Anaconda, they should have put this card to 1. Now the last card that I'll cover in the semi-limited list is Nadir's Servant, and I'm not going to cover the other new semi-limited cards because they're just cards that are being released to 2 rather than being reduced to 2. Anyways, Nadir's Servant is a really strong spell that essentially will get you access to either Dogmatica Punishment Pop or the Fleur Monster Negate because of the access to Ecclesia. Sending the App Clone from extra deck to grave also means they get access to Schism, which means access to Winda to lock your opponents out of special summoning. The card is still decently new, being released in Rise of the Duelist in summer of 2020, and some people did want this to be put to 2 at least a list or 2 ago, but now it is finally put to 2 and perhaps it will be put to 1 over time. Based on my prediction survey, there was still a good chunk that expected it to go as low as 1, with 15% calling it that it will be put to 2. Alright guys, so that was it for a data review on this new ban list. I know I didn't cover every new card on the list, but I more so focused on cards that I've done any form of data analysis on. Let me know if you enjoyed this kind of video, and if you did, I can do it again moving forward. Take care guys.